Well, this week we read of the rise of a new king who knew not Joseph. Inaugurations of U.S. presidents often correspond coincidentally with this parasha, the beginning of this most central story of the Jewish people. Years ago, I will not specify how many years ago, after a particularly contentious presidential election, I was told by a colleague that his board held an emergency meeting and determined that he would not be allowed to speak that year of Pharaoh in any sermons, lest it be read as an implied critique of the incoming president. Now, unless they would have struck out the entire story, like 19th century slaveholders in the British West Indies did, because they also believed that they could edit out the book of Exodus when it got too close to home, the comparisons would have remained evident to anyone who was half awake during the Torah reading. A new king arises, a small man who longs to be a strong man, guided by advisors who range from the callous ideologues to the willfully complicit. He fuels fractiousness and fear among the population, advancing systems of violence and cruelty to the most vulnerable as a mechanism of increasing profit and quashing dissent. That story, the story of the destruction that such a ruler can wreak, as well as the guidebook for how the people must respond to such a ruler should he arise, is found in the lines of this first parasha, this first Torah portion of the book of Exodus. All of that, the answers to the terrible questions that we may unfortunately need to be asking now once again in our time, remains forever embedded in our sacred literature. And even as we recall those timeless lessons, today I ask us to share focus with a lesson that we do not read in this parasha, to the story that we know, but that is not yet told here. The story that we need to remember in order to make sense not of what will happen in Washington, D.C. 2 days from now, but of what happened in Jerusalem yesterday and today, and what will, God willing, happen there tomorrow. Only hours before Shabbat, Israel's cabinet ratified the hostage release and ceasefire deal. The deal which we have been praying for and calling for many, many months, pressed on through very tough negotiations, overcoming last-minute opposition from extremists who seem to prefer death to life. One such rabbi this past week proclaimed, "There was no peace, there is no peace, and there will be no peace." It's true that this deal is not peace. It's also true that it's not a great deal. And it did not come soon enough for too many. Hearing that this is the same deal that was thwarted by both parties 8 months ago can break your heart. But on Sunday, God willing, we will witness the first 3 Israeli hostages to be returned home to their loved ones' arms. On Sunday, God willing, the children of Gaza will, for the first time in 472 days, be allowed to run and play outside again without fear. And soldiers will return home to their families and their graduate school programs and their lives. This could be the beginning of something new. Here's what I see when I open up the Torah this week. From the vantage point of the beginning of our parasha, we have absolutely no idea how very close we are to catastrophe. Ve'ele shmot b'nei Yisrael haba'im mitzrayma. These are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each one of them with their household. Followed by a list of names, the ultimate bestowing of dignity and possibility among the people. The descendants of Jacob are thriving and they are flourishing in the land of Egypt. They were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased greatly so that the land was filled with them. And yet, an instant later, their destiny is forever changed by a new king who sees in them not a blessing, but a threat. and generations of pain will follow. Each stage of punishment from Pharaoh grows progressively worse, from the crushing of the people with harsh labor to infanticide. The people are brought low under the weight of the oppression. When a dying Pharaoh demands the blood of Israelite children to save him from the disease that plagues his body, the people cry out. And it is this crying out, this desperate, piercing, unrelenting cry in the face of the barbarism around them that awakes God from an epic slumber of more than 100 years and begins the process of redemption. Ramban identifies this moment as the singular turning point in the history of the Exodus. We know that God is awakened by their wailing, their anguished cry, but they do not know it. All they know is that when Moshe will soon arrive, Moses, this insider, outsider, bringing a message of redemption, things will only get worse for them. Now, Pharaoh declares, now you must meet your output of bricks, but with no straw. Make their burden heavier, he says, so heavy that they will have no time to think about freedom. This is, of course, an impossible task, and the people are beaten mercilessly. Lazy, Pharaoh shouts, you are lazy, and the people groan in anguish. The only strength left in them, they use to turn on Moses and Aaron. May God judge you for the burden that you have placed upon us, they say. We are so much worse off now than before you arrived with your so-called message of hope, with your possibilities of peace and redemption. From the vantage point of the beginning of our parashah, we have no idea how close we are to catastrophe. But please hear me. From the vantage point of the end of our parashah, we have no idea how close we are to redemption. The reader knows, we know, because we know the story. We know how it ends. We know of the plagues that will come in the coming pages, of the triumph of the God of Israel over the vile and venal and empty power of Pharaoh. We know how the people Israel will arise from their degradation and straighten their back and paint the doors with blood and promise to remember forever the mysterious force that brings forth liberation even from the depths of darkness. But in the story, those suffering Israelites have no idea what is about to come. I offer this simple message to us today amidst the agony of the unknown of our time. After 15 months of unspeakable heartache and hardship, of catastrophic loss, and the utter undoing of not one but two peoples in body and spirit, we are right now at this moment at an inflection point, the beginning of the end of suffering, the beginning of the possibility of healing. We are going to see terrible realities unfold in the days ahead. Remember that there was much more suffering for the Israelites and Egyptians alike at the end of Parshat Shemot. Even when they made it out of the grasp of Pharaoh's armies, they were pursued and pinned at the edge of the sea. Even after those chariots drowned in the water behind them, there were new enemies on the road to the promised land. There were rebellions and hunger and heartache. An entire generation had to die off for the people to be able to enter the land and begin to build a different kind of society, a counter Egypt, a place that strove for radical accountability and just laws and systems that would protect everyone, especially the ger, the stranger, the other, the most vulnerable. Ki gerim ha'item be'eretz Mitzrayim, because we ourselves were strangers in the land. And even then, I don't need to tell you the story was not over. The land may have been promised, but it was never perfect, and neither were its people. The journey would continue in perpetuity. We too will experience terrible pain in the coming days when the hostage vans return and the doors are open. We will see reunion. We will see the embrace of children with their parents, of loved ones with their partners and friends. And we will see funerals for those whose families still held hope all of these long, terrible days, only to discover that their loved ones did not make it to this day. In a story that will be playing out 100 times over, Naama's family will await her return, and Edan's, and Matan's, and Liri's, and the Bibas family. Oded Lifshitz's family will await his return. Oded and his wife, lifelong peace builders in their 80s, living in the Gaza envelope, were abducted on October 7th. Yocheved was returned in the first phase, you might remember, of the deal. But Oded, they do not know if he's alive or dead. It was his grandson who painted the most vivid image of what we might see in the days ahead. Preparing for a festivity and a funeral simultaneously is impossible, he said. And when the rubble is cleared in Gaza, as the people there begin to rebuild, I fear that we will see even far greater destruction than we already know. So much has been lost. And on both sides of the border, a new trauma has been planted deep in the soul of millions of people. Lost for a generation are not only loved ones, but a sense of safety and normalcy and innocence. And all of this, if the deal is not thwarted by extremists, by politicians who have shown that they care more for their political survival than the survival of the people. Those who shamelessly peddle violence and more violence and more violence, perpetual war. Our brethren who are intoxicated by messianic fantasies that they dare to proclaim in God's own name, as if land matters more than life, as if one can love God while dehumanizing and destroying God's image in human beings. It is facing this certainty, the festivities and the funerals, that I need us to remember. At that moment, at the end of Parshat Shemot, after hundreds of years of suffering, the redemption was very, very close. They just did not know it. And for us too, the redemption can be very, very close right now. Rav Avira in Masechet Sotah in the Talmud claims that the women are responsible for the redemption of the people. Now, this might seem like an overstatement if you know the story. Not Moses, not Aaron, not God, the Holy One with a strong hand and outstretched arm. No, says Rav Avira, it's the women. And it's not only Shifra and Pua and Batya and Yocheved, women who took incredibly courageous actions in the parsha that Micah read to us today. But it's also Miriam, who from the hellscape of Egyptian bondage, as a child of only 5 or 6 years, berated her parents for heeding Pharaoh's decree of infanticide, preempting future loss by divorcing and refusing to bring more children into this cruel world. You, she said, waving her little 5 or 6-year-old finger, you are worse than Pharaoh himself. You are doing the work of the enemy when you give up your hope. You are doing the work of the enemy when you give up on life just because of the possibility of death. Even in the face of the gravest of threats, Miriam is saying, we must live. We must love. It is that cry, the cry of a small child, that reunites her parents and results in the birth of Moshe, Moses, who will lead the people out of Egypt. Into the void of the great unknown that lies before us now, into those festivities and those funerals. I pray that we remember Miriam's cry. We must allow some part of our souls to see beyond the agony and the anguish, and to have the audacity to dream of a different kind of future, one of a just peace, one of quiet, of tending gardens and going to school and reading and writing books, making art and building new alliances and new friendships and healing. I know that this is possible, even if we can't quite see it yet from our vantage point. May this ceasefire be the beginning of the end. An end to the agony of the hostages and the torturous uncertainty of their families. An end to the devastation and suffering of the people of Gaza. An end to the heartache and sorrow of Israelis and Palestinians and all who love them. An end to the corruption and callousness that perpetuates war at all costs. An end to the lie that we can do no better. And may it be the beginning of a time of healing and sacred reunion, the beginning of a future of safety, of dignity, of justice, and peace for all who call that holy land home. Shabbat Shalom.